In the scorching midday heat of the SEAL training yard, Claire Mason, the petite woman in a faded training uniform with no rank insignia, had barely stepped in when a group of male recruits whistled, jeering. "This is a man's arena." Chief Harris, the SEAL instructor, smirked and told her she'd break a bone if she tried. Everyone thought this would be nothing but a joke. But when Harris closed in to strike, Claire pivoted, locked his joint, and stripped the training weapon from his belt in a single motion. The metallic clang as it hit the sand left the entire yard frozen in silence. It all started a week earlier when Claire stood outside the base gate, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder, staring at the barbed wire fence. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, no makeup, no jewelry, just a plain gray t-shirt and cargo pants. A guard glanced at her, his eyes narrowing like she was some lost civilian who'd wandered too far. He waved her over, asking for her ID with a tone that said he didn't expect her to have one. Claire handed it over without a word, her face calm, almost blank. The guard's eyebrows shot up when he saw the clearance level, but he didn't say anything. He just handed it back and waved her through. As she walked past, she caught him muttering to another guard who let someone like her in here. Claire didn't flinch. She adjusted her bag and kept moving, her boots crunching on the gravel. That moment wasn't new for her. Growing up in a family that owned half the skyline in Chicago, Claire had been taught early to carry herself with quiet strength. Her father, a man who negotiated billion-dollar deals before breakfast, drilled into her that power didn't need to shout. Her mother, a philanthropist who moved in elite circles, showed her how to walk into a room and own it without saying a word. But Claire never leaned into that world. She wore plain clothes, kept her nails short, and spoke only when it mattered. People took one look at her and decided she didn't belong. Too small, too plain, too quiet. They didn't know she'd been training in martial arts since she was 6, or that her family's wealth could buy the entire base she was walking into. They just saw a woman who didn't fit their idea of strong. As Claire crossed the base toward the barracks, a jeep rolled by, kicking up dust that stung her eyes. The driver, a young officer with slicked back hair and a pressed uniform, slowed down just enough to lean out the window. "Hey you," he called, his voice sharp with authority. "You're in the wrong place. Civilians don't wander around here." Claire kept walking, her pace steady, but she glanced at him, her eyes catching the glint of his polished badge. He scoffed loud enough for the nearby recruits to hear. "What, you deaf? Go back to the visitors center." A few soldiers nearby chuckled, nudging each other. Claire stopped, turned to face him, and tilted her head slightly. "I'm where I'm supposed to be," she said, her voice even like she was stating a fact. The officer's face twitched, but before he could respond, she turned and kept walking, leaving him gripping the steering wheel a little too tight. "Hey, before we go further, if this story is hitting you, maybe you felt that same sting of being underestimated. Could you grab your phone real quick? Give this video a like, drop a comment below about what's resonating, and hit that subscribe button. It means a lot to share these stories with you, and your support keeps this channel going. Alright, let's get back to Claire. The training yard was a different beast. It was a Thursday, and the sun was brutal, baking the sand until it shimmered. Claire stood at the edge of the field, stretching her arms, her faded uniform already sticking to her skin. The recruits, all men, were clustered in groups, laughing too loud, their voices carrying across the open space. One of them, a tall guy with a buzz cut and a smirk that screamed frat boy confidence, spotted her first. His name was Derek, the kind of guy who wore his ego like a badge and thought charm could cover cruelty. "Yo, sweetheart," he called out loud enough for everyone to hear. "You lost. The admin office is that way." The group around him snickered, a few clapping him on the back like he just won a debate. Before Claire could even settle into her stretches, a female recruit named Jenna, with perfectly manicured nails and a ponytail that swung like a metronome, sauntered over. She was the type who thrived on attention, always angling for a higher rank through charm rather than skill. "Honey, you're embarrassing yourself," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "This is SEAL training, not a gym class for beginners." She flicked her eyes over Claire's plain uniform, her lips curling into a sneer. "And that outfit? Did you borrow it from the laundry bin?" The men around her laughed, egging her on. Claire didn't look up. She just kept stretching, her hands moving slowly over her calves, but her fingers paused for a fraction of a second. "It gets the job done," she said quietly, her eyes flicking to Jenna's polished boots. Jenna's smile faltered, but she tossed her hair and walked away, muttering, "Whatever. Good luck not crying later." Claire didn't look at her. She bent down to retie her boot, her fingers moving slow and deliberate. Another recruit, shorter with a wiry build and a chipped front tooth, chimed in. His name was Mike, and he had that fake nice tone that hit like a knife. "No, seriously, lady, this is hand-to-hand training. You sure you're in the right place? You're going to get hurt." The others laughed harder, and one guy in the back, a beefy recruit named Travis, who always needed to be the loudest, shouted, "What's she going to do, braid our hair?" The yard erupted, and even a few of the instructors smirked, leaning against the fence like they were watching a stand-up routine. Claire stood up, her eyes scanning the group. She didn't say anything, just walked toward the sandbag row and started her warm-up, her movements smooth and precise. Every punch she threw into the bag was controlled, her shoulders steady, her feet planted like she'd done this 1,000 times. The laughter died down a little, but not enough. Derek stepped closer, crossing his arms, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look, I'm just saying this isn't a yoga class. You're out of your league here." Claire paused mid-punch, her fist still against the bag. She turned her head slightly, just enough to meet his eyes. "Am I?" she asked, her voice low, steady, like she was asking about the weather. Derek blinked, caught off guard, and before he could answer, she went back to hitting the bag. As Claire worked the sandbags, a grizzled instructor named Porter with a scar running down his cheek and a permanent scowl walked over to the group. He was the kind of man who'd seen combat in places most recruits couldn't pronounce, and he didn't bother hiding his disdain for anyone he thought didn't measure up. He stopped a few feet from Claire, watching her with narrowed eyes. "You're wasting space," he said loud enough for the whole yard to hear. "This isn't a charity. If you can't keep up, get out now." The recruits snickered, and Travis called out, "Yeah, save us the trouble of carrying you off." Claire didn't stop punching. Her rhythm didn't falter, but her eyes flicked to Porter for a moment, sharp and unyielding. "I'll stay," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Porter's scowl deepened, but he turned away, muttering something about wasting his time. That's when Lieutenant Harris, the head SEAL instructor, stepped into the center of the yard. Harris was a mountain of a man, mid-40s with a crew cut and a jaw that looked like it could crack stone. He had a reputation for breaking recruits, not just physically, but mentally, and he loved the power. He clapped his hands, the sound sharp enough to make everyone stop. "All right, listen up," he barked. "Anyone who thinks they're tough enough, step in with me. Let's see what you've got." The recruits roared, pumping their fists, ready to show off. No one even glanced at Claire. They figured she'd stay on the sidelines, maybe take notes or fetch water. But then Claire stepped forward. She didn't rush, didn't hesitate, just walked into the center of the yard, tying her hair tighter as she went. The whole place went quiet for a second, like the air got sucked out. Then the laughter started again, louder this time. Travis cupped his hands around his mouth and yelled, "Oh, come on, this is going to be good." Mike leaned over to Derek, muttering loud enough for everyone to hear, "She's got guts, I'll give her that, but she's about to eat sand." Harris squinted at her, his smirk growing. "All right then, little lady," he said, his voice slow and mocking. 30 seconds and you're out." The yard exploded with laughter like they were all in on the same cruel joke. Claire didn't react. She just stood there, her hands loose at her sides, her eyes locked on Harris. He got into stance, his shoulders squared, his feet planted wide. The crowd pressed closer, their shouts blending into a wall of noise. Harris lunged fast, grabbing her shoulder and spinning her hard to throw her off balance. Claire stumbled back, her boots kicking up dust, and the recruits went wild. "Told you she's weak," Derek shouted, pointing like he had called it. Travis added, "Go back to the kitchen, sweetheart." Harris, still holding her shoulder, brushed the back of his hand against her cheek. A deliberate, belittling move, like he was swatting a fly. The crowd roared louder, eating it up. Right then, a young recruit named Eddie, barely 19 with acne still dotting his face, stepped forward from the crowd. He was the quiet one, always hanging back, but now his voice cracked with nervous energy. "Come on, Harris, don't go easy on her just 'cause she's a girl," he shouted, trying to fit in with the louder guys. The others laughed, but it was meaner now, like they were daring Harris to prove something. Claire's fingers tightened briefly on her own wrist, the only sign she'd heard him. She stepped back into position, her posture loose, but ready, her eyes never leaving Harris. Eddie's face flushed when she glanced his way, and he looked down suddenly, unsure, but the damage was done. The crowd's energy surged, feeding off his words. Claire stopped moving. She stood there, dust settling around her boots, and lifted her eyes to meet his. Her face didn't change, but something in her gaze made Harris pause, just for a split second. Then he went for his next move, a quick step to lock her arm and force her down. But before he could close the distance, Claire pivoted smooth as water, using his momentum to twist his arm at the joint. It was so fast it looked like a blur. 1 second he was charging, the next he was frozen. His arm locked at an angle that made his face twitch. The crowd went silent, mouths half open, not sure what they'd just seen. Claire held him there for a beat, then let go, stepping back. "Shall we continue?" she asked, her voice calm, like she was offering him a seat. The yard stayed quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like it's holding its breath. Harris shook out his arm, his jaw tight, and the recruits started glancing at each other, unsure. Then the sergeant in the back, a wiry guy named Collins, with a voice that always sounded like he was shouting through a megaphone, broke the silence. "Harris, don't you dare lose to a girl," he yelled, and the crowd laughed again, but it was nervous now, less certain. Harris gritted his teeth and charged harder, aiming to lock her neck this time. He got close, his hand closing on her shoulder, and for a moment it looked like he had her. The recruits leaned in, smirking, ready for the takedown. "Now you're done," Harris growled, his voice thick with confidence. But Claire didn't fall. She dropped her weight, twisted her wrist outward, and slipped free of his hold like it was nothing. In the same motion, she turned her hips, swept his arm aside, and yanked the training knife from his belt. The blade hit the ground right in front of his boot, the metallic clang cutting through the air like a gunshot. The entire yard went dead silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Claire stepped back, picking up the knife with 2 fingers and holding it out to him. "Weapons shouldn't be left so exposed," she said, her voice steady, like she was pointing out a loose shoelace. Harris stared at her, his face blank, the knife dangling between them. As Claire handed the knife back, a supply clerk named Rachel, who'd been watching from the sidelines with a clipboard clutched to her chest, let out a loud scoff. She was the type who loved gossip, always whispering about who was failing or who was getting promoted. "Oh, please," she said, rolling her eyes loud enough for everyone to hear. She probably practiced that one move for weeks, doesn't mean she's any good. The recruits nearby nodded, desperate to cling to their skepticism. Claire's hand paused just for a moment as she set the knife on the ground. She straightened up her eyes, flicking to Rachel, who flinched under the gaze, but kept her chin up. "One move's enough," Claire said, her voice so soft it barely carried. But Rachel's face went red, and she turned away, pretending to check her clipboard. The recruits didn't know what to do. Some shuffled their feet, others looked away. Derek, the frat boy type, tried to laugh it off, but it came out weak. "That was just luck," he shouted, his voice cracking a little. Mike, the fake nice one, jumped in his chipped tooth, flashing as he spoke. "No way you can do it twice. Let's see it again." They were grasping now, trying to claw back the control they thought they had. The crowd started chanting again, like it was a game, like they could wear her down. Claire just shrugged her face unreadable and turned to walk back to the sandbags. She wasn't here to perform for them. Just then, a radio crackled on the sidelines, and a voice came through sharp and urgent, calling for Harris. It was the base commander's aide, a nervous-looking man named Walsh, who rarely left his desk. He jogged over his glasses, slipping down his nose, and whispered something to Harris. The instructor's face tightened, and he glanced at Claire, his eyes narrowing like he'd just been told something he didn't want to hear. The recruits noticed their chance faltering. Walsh handed Harris a folded piece of paper, and as Harris read it, his shoulder stiffened. He stuffed it in his pocket and waved Walsh off, but not before Claire's eyes caught the edge of the paper. a seal with a familiar crest. She didn't react, just went back to adjusting her gloves, but her fingers moved a little slower, like she was piecing something together. Harris, his face red and his jaw tight, wasn't done. He tossed the knife aside and stepped forward again, this time faster, more aggressive. He threw a hook, aiming for her shoulder, his whole body leaning into it. Claire didn't flinch. She leaned aside just enough and circled behind him in one fluid motion. Before anyone could blink, she slammed him into the sand with a single hip throw. Harris hit the ground hard, flat on his back, his hands bracing against the dirt. His eyes were wide, his breath coming in short gasps. The recruits froze their chants, dying in their throats. From the fence, the base colonel, a gray-haired man in a crisp uniform, allowed himself a faint smile, his arms crossed as he watched. As Harris lay there catching his breath, a recruit named Lopez Stocky, with a tattoo of a snake on his forearm, pushed through the crowd. He was the guy who always had a story about his street fighting days, always bragging about his scars. "This is a fluke," he shouted, his voice rough like he was trying to convince himself. "She's just quick, that's all. No strength behind it." He stepped closer, pointing at Claire, who was already walking away. "Bet you can't take me." The crowd murmured, some nodding, others unsure. Claire paused, her hand on the shed door, and turned just enough to look at him. "I don't need to," she said, her voice flat, but sharp, like a blade sliding into its sheath. Lopez's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The colonel's smile widened just a fraction. Claire didn't linger. She adjusted her shirt, tucked a stray hair behind her ear, and walked toward the storage shed, pushing the door open with one hand. The recruits parted as she passed, some instinctively standing straighter, like they were at attention. Harris sat up still on the ground, watching her go. His face wasn't angry anymore. It was something else, something like respect mixed with disbelief. Derek, the loudmouth, muttered under his breath, "She isn't just a regular soldier." His voice was low, like he didn't want anyone to hear him admit it. Claire didn't look back. She didn't need to. Later that day, in the mess hall, the air was thick with tension. Claire sat alone at a corner table, eating a plain sandwich, her eyes on her plate. The recruits kept their distance, but their whispers carried. Jenna, the manicured recruit, leaned over to a group at the next table, her voice loud enough to cut through the clatter of trays. "She's probably some officer's niece got in through connections," she said, tossing her ponytail. "No way she's legit." A few recruits nodded, but others glanced at Claire, unsure. She took a slow bite of her sandwich, her movements deliberate, and set her fork down with a soft clink. "Connections don't win fights," she said, not looking up, her voice carrying just far enough. Jenna's face froze, and she busied herself with her tray, her confidence crumbling. That evening in the command office, Harris sat at a desk, flipping through a file with Claire's name on it. The room was quiet, just the hum of the air conditioner and the rustle of papers. The file was thick, each page detailing missions most people would never hear about. "Former Ghost Viper operative," it read. 9 inner allied hand-to-hand victories undefeated. "Let it be." Harris leaned back in his chair, exhaling a long breath. "So it's you," he said to the empty room, a wry smile tugging at his lips. He closed the file and set it down, his hands resting on the desk like he was trying to make sense of it all. The next morning, Claire was back in the shed cleaning weapons with the same steady focus she always had. Her hands moved over the rifles, checking each part with care, her face calm as ever. When she stepped out into the yard, the recruits stopped what they were doing. One by one, they stood at attention, their eyes following her. She didn't acknowledge it, just nodded. Once, and kept walking her boots, leaving soft prints in the sand. To them, she was something else now, a living legend. The quiet woman who'd turned their world upside down without raising her voice. But the story didn't end there. The recruits who'd mocked her started to feel the weight of their words. Derek, the frat boy type, got called into the colonel's office that afternoon. He came out pale, his smirk gone, carrying a letter that said his training contract was terminated. No explanation, just a signature and a date. By the next day, his name was off the roster. Mike, the one with the chipped tooth, didn't fare much better. A video surfaced online, not from Claire, but from someone who'd been in the yard that day. It showed his fake nice comments, his laughter, his taunts. The comment section tore him apart, and his sponsorship with a local gym chain was dropped by the end of the week. Travis, the loud one, found himself iced out by the other recruits. They stopped inviting him to drinks, stopped saving him a spot in line. He was alone now, his voice quieter each day. In the days that followed, a quiet shift happened on the base. During a morning drill, an older instructor named Grayson, who'd been silent during the yard incident, approached Claire as she packed up her gear. He was a man of few words, his face weathered from years in the field. He handed her a worn leather journal, the kind soldiers carried for notes. "I saw what you did out there," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. Not many could have pulled that off. Claire took the journal, her fingers brushing the cracked cover, and nodded. She didn't open it, just tucked it into her bag. Grayson watched her for a moment, then turned away, but not before the recruits nearby noticed. They exchanged looks, their whispers quieter now, tinged with something like respect. Claire didn't say a word about any of it. She didn't need to. She kept showing up, kept training, kept cleaning weapons in the shed. Her silence wasn't weak anymore. It was heavy, like it carried the truth of who she was. People started whispering her name, not with mockery, but with something close to awe. They had misjudged her, written her off, and now they were paying for it. Not because she demanded it, but because the world had a way of balancing itself out. One afternoon, as Claire was wiping down a rifle, the shed door creaked open. A man stepped inside, tall with broad shoulders and a quiet presence that filled the room without effort. He wore civilian clothes, a simple jacket and jeans, but the way he carried himself said he wasn't just anyone. The recruits outside stopped talking, their eyes darting toward him. Harris, who'd been barking orders, froze mid-sentence. Derek, who was lingering nearby, looked away, his hands stuffed in his pockets. Mike's face went pale, like he'd seen a ghost. The man didn't speak, didn't introduce himself. He just walked up to Claire, placed a hand on her shoulder, and nodded a nod. She looked up, her face softening for the first time all week, and nodded back. The room changed in that moment. It wasn't about power or wealth or titles. It was about recognition. The man was her husband, a figure whose name didn't need to be said. Everyone knew who he was, what he represented. His presence wasn't loud, but it was undeniable, like a storm cloud rolling in, slow. Claire closed the rifle case, her movement steady as always, and walked out with him, her bag slung over her shoulder. The recruits watched in silence, their heads turning as she passed. Nobody laughed, nobody spoke. They just watched her go, knowing they'd never see her the same way again. The consequences kept coming, quiet, but real. Collins, the sergeant who'd shouted at Harris not to lose to a girl, was reassigned to a desk job the next month. His voice didn't carry the same weight anymore, and he knew it. The base itself changed too. Instructors started checking files before opening their mouths. Recruits stopped throwing around careless taunts. Claire's name became a kind of shorthand, a warning to never underestimate the quiet ones. She didn't stay long after that day, just long enough to finish her assignment and move on. But her presence lingered in the way people stood, a little straighter, spoke a little softer, thought a little harder before judging. Years before, when Claire was still a teenager, she had stood in her father's office, a cavernous room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He had handed her a book on discipline, its pages worn from years of use. "You don't need to be loud to be strong," he had said, his voice steady, his eyes on her, like she was the only thing in the world. She nodded, taking the book at her fingers, tracing the spine. That moment came back to her sometimes in the way she moved, the way she held her ground. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about knowing who she was, even when nobody else did. As Claire prepared to leave the base, a young recruit named Sarah, who'd been silent through most of the training, approached her near the gate. Sarah was small with nervous eyes, always clutching her water bottle like a lifeline. "I saw what you did," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I want to be like that, not afraid." Claire looked at her, her eyes softening just a touch. She reached into her bag, pulled out a small folded piece of paper, a training schedule she'd written by hand, and handed it to Sarah. "Start here," she said, her voice calm but firm. Sarah took it, her hands trembling, and nodded at the deer. Claire turned to go, but Sarah's quiet "Thank you" followed her, hanging in the air like a promise. Back in the present, Claire walked out of the base one last time, her husband beside her. The gate clanged shut behind them, and the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the gravel. She didn't look back, didn't need to. The world had seen her, and that was enough. For everyone watching, it's a reminder you don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need to fight to win. Sometimes just standing your ground is enough. The truth always catches up. You're not alone in this. You never were. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.